this organization called Population Connection.
Ooh, interesting.
Okay, so this is crazy. This is insane, but you wouldn't believe it except that it's true. And they have these workshops where they train teachers. And he has trained on the order of like 100,000 teachers in America over the years through this organization, which is active today. And it educates in American and Canadian schools 3 million students a year.
Oh,
This
good
is
Lord.
Wow.
this is
Yeah.
insane. What we see here is an example from their most popular video. So he has this thing that starts in the year 1. So you can see the header on top shows this is the world population in the year 1, like as in the time of the Romans and like when Jesus walked the earth and stuff like that. So this is 170 million. So that's the baseline that he's using to show overpopulation now, because this is like this is less than the current population of.
So that's what we need to go back to is a Roman times pre-industrial, of course.
Yes, that's what we want.
So this video that he has, like it shows like a little exploding bomb. Okay,
Oh, no.
in every time like there's more population added, and so it literally looks like the world of today is like on fire with people. And this is the education that's going out under the guise of environmentalism to like millions of students.
Would you like to know more?
Hi, everyone. I am so excited today to have a very, very special guest, Daniel, who we've always really known and who you might know already as More Births on Twitter. This is our favorite demographic collapse account. Daniel, you have the most thoughtful threads. You are very passionate about demographic collapse, but also very articulate and focused on the data. So we're super excited to have you on because you often look at elements of the data and elements of demographic collapse that we're not talking about as much. And I think we have a lot to dig into. So let's just do it. But as a big reminder to everyone, if you aren't already following More Births on Twitter, do it now, because these are
and you could
tweets.
follow us on Twitter while you're at it.
I mean, yeah, we're there too at Simone H.
Malcolm?
Collins.
Yeah, Simone H. Collins, yeah.
Because we haven't changed.
Anyway, let's dive into the data, because that's what our fans are all about, is data.
Yeah, so we first wanted to discuss, and this is something that came from your very good suggestion, Daniel, so thank you, culture and examples of countries that achieved a more prenatal culture, because we're really good on this podcast at talking about the failure cases, but maybe we can go through something a little more encouraging.
Yeah, I'd love to. And that's something I really, really try hard to do, is to focus on the data, because everybody has their own opinions on what the cause of the fertility collapse are. And there's a lot of causes, but I try to be minimalist as far as my own opinions and maximalist as far as the data. So I want to go right into things. So the first thing I want to talk about is the cultural impact of fertility, because culture is really the dominant factor, much more, and you guys have talked about this a lot on Basecamp, is that the impact of incentives is not enough. It's not enough that you need culture. So I want to go through different examples of how culture makes a difference. And so here I'm going to try to share something.
Cool, I'll bring it up.
Yeah, okay, so what we're seeing here. So what this is, can we see this?
Now we can.
So here we're talking about France. So this is one of my favorite examples of the power of culture. So what we see is fertility in the 1800s in France versus fertility today. So France had a huge culture change in the 1800s, long before anybody else. So France ended up with like super low fertility in starting with the French Revolution.
So clarify, because a lot of our audience listens only audio, so do keep that in mind when you're describing what's in the graph.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Go for like what we're looking at.
Okay, so what we're seeing this is two maps of Europe side by side with fertility in the 1800s and fertility in 2019, so very recently. Mm-hmm. So what we see in the 1800s is that France has fertility like a whole order of magnitude less than the rest of Europe. And that was the result of the French Revolution and secularization. And you can know this from you can know that that's what was going on because you can look at like you can look at the records that people left behind of wills, and whether it was like a church will or a secular will, and it went from like 90% church type wills or religious type wills to like 90% secular. So it was an extreme secularization that happened in France after the French Revolution, and they ended up with like the lowest fertility in Europe by a mile.
And
Now,
I want to be clear to people who are looking at this. What's interesting about the 1800s map is it does it by county and not just by country. And yet you can see that by county, there is a very sort of tight line around France. So it's not like you get a cultural bleed or much of a cultural bleed in the border regions, which is very interesting, as it means that legalistic changes within France likely precipitated this cultural change that he's describing. And I've seen other compelling evidence that it really was the secularization. I don't know what piece I might be thinking of. You probably know the one I'm thinking of, where somebody argued with a lot of data that it really was specifically the secularization that caused France early fertility collapse.
yeah, and you can you can find stuff like that actually if you go to more births on Twitter and you do a search of at more births, and for example France, you're gonna you'll find stuff where I link to that particular study from which this map is taken. So then we can see in 2019 you can see the fertility rate in all the European countries, and France has the highest fertility rate in all of Europe. So France went from the lowest to the highest. Now it's still below replacement, but this is a massive difference.
So do you have a theory on this? Because I can get mine.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just talking about it. Like recently, Macron, saw France's birth rates were going down again, and he just gets on the mic on national TV and stuff and says, "Guys, we need to increase our birth rate." He just comes right out and says it. Now, you can't imagine like a British prime minister or Canadian prime minister or U.S. president, coming out and saying, "Guys, we need to increase our birth rate." That has never happened. Trump has, but yeah, okay. Yeah,
but I mean, normal. Yeah, I
he
hear what
didn't
you're
say
saying.
Normal people do.
I would argue that something else is actually happening here, because you see this across populations, and it's a very interesting trend, and it has to do with cultural evolution. The very fact that France's fertility rate fell early is what has caused it to be more robust today. And we actually see evidence for this elsewhere on the map. If you look at other regions that had a falling early fertility rate, for example, you can see this in, I think that's Estonia, right? The bottom of the other red spot there. It's also a uniquely high fertility rate country today when contrasted with the rest of Europe.
well, I hear that. Yeah, what I
So
do want
here's
to
why.
go on.
I want to go into why this happens, because I think it's not just in France where this is the case. Any population group, because in the US, for example, if you look at American-born Catholics, like Catholics who have been in America and immigrated a long time ago, and the speed of their fertility fall, and you contrast that with recent Catholic immigrants from developing countries, their fertility collapses, the immigrants, much faster than the native-born Catholics. And so what I think is going on here is that countries that have for a long time dealt with mimetically caused low fertility rates, cultural groups within those countries and regions have had longer to adapt intergenerational strategies that keep their fertility rates high in spite of the factors that lead to low fertility rates. I think that this in large part explains high Jewish fertility rates, because Jewish populations have disproportionately, for example, 98% of Jews in the US lived in urban centers, which are the lowest fertility regions. And they've been doing that for a very long time. So they've had to adapt to cultural techniques used within the urban monoculture to lower fertility rates in the groups around them and recruit people for much, much, much longer than other populations. And I suspect that that's what we're seeing within these maps.
I hear that. I do want to add, one thing, which is, and this is my next example that I want to share, and maybe I can share that now. I'll close this window and try to share something else, and then we can talk about that. I want to talk about Mongolia, the case of Inner and Outer Mongolia, because nobody ever talks about this. And this is very spicy because this is new information for probably almost everybody. So here we go. Let me share. Let me see. I gotta open the.
Yeah, don't worry about dead spots because Malcolm edits them out. And thank you for your amazing editing, Malcolm.
Sure.
Oh, thank you.
Here we go. Can we see this?
All right, hold on. Yep, now we're good.
So what we have, this is the example of Mongolia. So there's what's called Outer Mongolia, which is what we consider to be Mongolia proper. This is like the country of Mongolia. And then you've got Inner Mongolia, which is in China. And so the fertility in Outer Mongolia is 2.75 or so, almost 3 births per woman. The fertility in Inner Mongolia, by contrast, is like 0.75 or so. It's like almost like a quarter as much.
Yeah, wow.
So you have this insane difference between Outer Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, and they're right next to each other.
So Outer Mongolia isn't under the CCP, correct? I'm
Right.
trying
So
to.
so I'll tell you what the difference is that Mongolia, the country of Mongolia, was under the Soviet sphere, and the Soviet sphere, so they were both Outer and Inner Mongolia were under communist influence for many, many decades. But Mongolia, the country, which we call which is also called Outer Mongolia, was in the Soviet sphere, and that was always pro-natalist. Like they had pro-natalist message messaging all the time. They have something like, maybe you've heard of like former Soviet countries have like these things like called like the Order of Maternal Glory,
Exactly.
which is like
Yeah.
this medal that women would get, like if they had like a whole bunch of kids, and they could get if they had like 8 kids, you get the Order of Maternal Glory. If you have like 6 kids, you get the Order of Maternal Glory second class.
So I'm gonna push back
Pathetic.
on this thesis because most former Soviet states have unusually low fertility rates for their economic status.
Well, yeah, I hear that, and that's something. Well, what's interesting is that when they were under the Soviet rule, they had high fertility, and so when they kind of switched over to capitalism and switched over to the Western mode, that's when fertility dropped. The thing that I want to talk about with Inner Mongolia is that, of course, they were under China. They're in China, and so they got the antenatal message. It was China, of course, had the one-child policy, but that's not the only thing. If you look at fertility plummeted in China before the one-child policy. It plummeted from propaganda, and it plummeted in Korea. It plummeted in like Hong Kong, Taiwan, all the other places. And so my point is that actually messaging, whether it's pronatal or antenatal, actually seems to have a very large impact.
So I'm gonna have a different hypothesis on what's causing this one in Mongolia, and Simone, you can decide which you find more compelling. So if I remember correctly, the Outer Mongolia is a different country. It's not under the CCP, right?
Yeah. So that Outer Mongolia is that's what we consider to be Mongolia.
As a country, right?
This
Yes,
is
Inner Mongolia.
what looks dark on this map here.
But they're otherwise about equivalent in terms of their economic state right now, right?
Yeah, the GDP per capita is comparable in Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. So the China part and the Mongolia part have, within the same order of magnitude, certainly.
So then my hypothesis would be what's causing the difference is the level of hope, because we've seen this in other regions, like in Georgia. When you get a lot of hope, your fertility rate typically increases, or when you believe that there is hope for your people, your fertility rate increases. And the CCP, I mean, across the board, has unusually low fertility wherever it operates. And my assumption is it's because people born into the CCP just have very little hope that their kids will be anything other than a disposable resource for the CCP, and that they won't really have any chance to move up within society or capture any sort of like autonomy, and that their culture will be erased more. I mean, obviously, China historically very famously attempts to erase the cultural uniqueness of its subject populations that are different from the Han, outside of a few token holidays and stuff like that. So I suspect that that's probably what's happening
Well,
here.
there is, if we can look at this same map, there's another example on this map actually, which I wasn't gonna, which just occurs to me now, which is North Korea.
Yeah.
So you can see North Korea is close to replacement fertility.
Yeah.
And this kind of also goes to my thesis, that the simple fact of, leadership and the broader culture being pronatal or antenatal like makes a big difference. South Korea had like, and I have many examples of this on my Twitter feed. Had all this antenatal propaganda telling people to have one child.
Mhm.
You can see all these. I put propaganda posters, on my Twitter feed, so you can see that they have this. Meanwhile, North Korea, like they have always been, sort of pronatal. Like actually, there was a video, I think, from early December that made the rounds in media where Kim Jong Un, the leader of North Korea, was talking to a convocation of like mothers and women, and he was just crying and crying and crying because like you're not having enough babies, guys.
Oh my gosh.
Like
I
it was
love it.
crazy.
Well, it's interesting that you point this out because I mean, my take on North Korea, that's pretty clear. So I think this is out of date because I remember the last I looked, North Korea actually has a pretty abysmal fertility rate now.
It is at least 2 times what it is in South Korea. So
I
that's
don't remember that being true anymore. I remember it being close to South Korea's rate. I can check this right now. Actually, let's check this. North
Yeah,
Korea.
well, we got to remember South Korea now is at 0.72. So
yeah. I mean, it's pretty easy to beat.
yeah, it's a pretty low bar.
Okay, let's
So
see.
we can see what that is.
Okay, apparently FTR is an acronym they use elsewhere.
North Korea's fertility rate is 1.38, but way above South Korea.
That is way above.
That is almost twice. So it's,
Yeah, that's almost twice.
Yeah, and they're dealing with real hardship.
But hold on,
famine.
but what I was going to say is that North Korea's fertility rate, to me, seems more indicative of a country in extreme poverty. I mean, this is something you see across the board. It's like when people are talking to me about high fertility rates, we go, well, why don't we like copy whatever the countries in like Africa are doing? And I'm like, what the countries in Africa are doing is extreme poverty. Like we know this. The poorer a country is, typically the higher its fertility rate is, and the poorer somebody is within a country, typically the higher their fertility rate is. So I don't know if I would take anything away from the North Korea example.
well, okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, but I do think, and I feel pretty confident on this, is that a part of the difference between sort of inner and outer Mongolia is that in one place everybody their whole lives have been hearing that children are good, have more children. In inner Mongolia, as part of China, for most of their lives until like very recently, they were hearing like have less children. If you have more children, we're going to do even forced abortions and all like this. So it was it was pretty. Yeah, it was pretty antenatal, and there seems to be a long shadow.
Yeah.
Simone, what's your take
for that?
I think that this sounds terribly diplomatic, but I do think that there's a lot of weight to both of your arguments, that you're kind of talking about the same thing, which is what's going through prospective parents or would-be parents' minds when they're thinking about, should I keep this pregnancy, or should I have this kid, or do I want kids in the first place? And a combination of a lack of hope for the future or deep concern about the future, whether or not that's realistic. And I do think that in South Korea there can be, in North Korea.
I'm gonna push back here. It actually functionally matters, the difference between our perspectives, because it's a difference in policy and a big difference in policy.
I disagree, because you can have really bleak prospects, and I think North Korea does, but you can still tell everyone that things are really great and that you should have kids. And I do think that could have.
We're talking about
the
Mongolia thing here, Simone.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think in both cases, I actually think that what leaders say, over the course of time, and what kind of the cultural zeitgeist is, seems to make a significant difference. And that's kind of the example that I was talking about with France, where I really think that in France after World War II, because France had a stagnant population, Germany's population exploded, the UK's population exploded, and then France got their rear end handed to them in World War II. And that's that was such a shocking thing that leaders, but started they had a lot of pronatal policies, but leaders also just started talking like have more children. They said it just outright all the time. And that seems to.
Well, but sometimes undergoing extreme hardship, losing family members
does increase fertility. We know that
increase
from the tsunami
fertility rate. Yeah.
But I wanted to focus on the difference in policy proposals that you would get from these two positions, because I think the Mongolia thing that you note is really interesting, and it's something I haven't dug deep on, and I do want to dig deeper on this as a topic to find out what all the differences are between the two regions, because it could be a key to some angle here that we haven't taken yet. However, the two policy proposals I would take for this is from you, it would be more government propaganda around normalizing large families and creating expectations around large
Yeah, or
families.
it doesn't have to be government even. It could be, one thing that Lyman Stone, who's a he's kind of an interesting guy, but he's a
Yeah.
demographer extraordinaire. But he's given the example with South Korea. He said if he could have a policy, he would his policy would be that the K-pop stars, need to. You can't be right now. They have this weird thing where they want the contracting companies want all the K-pop stars to be like childless and single, so they're better heartthrobs.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't date.
So he would say that his policy would be that you can't be a K-pop star unless you have kids.
So that's a interesting. It's not that I don't argue that this would work, but I think that you would see a larger fertility increase from policy positions that increase the feeling of meritocracy in a society than things that directly target fertility.
That's possible. I have another example that I want to move on to.
Let's do that.
Let me see. There we go.
I mean, so Malcolm, what you're saying though is that you think that people will feel
I think
like
that, for example, no matter what China does, no matter how much the CCP pushes 3 kids is glorious, they're not going to increase the fertility rate until they really start caring about their citizens or they start dramatically removing their rights. I think those are the only 2 paths that they can go, like forced insemination and stuff like that.
Well, I have a lot to talk about with China as well. We can go into that soon, but this is another one I want to talk about. So this is something that very few people know about. So maybe you can consider this a spicy take too. But this is Israel. This is Jewish people in Europe before World War II. They have extremely low fertility. So this is looking at crude birth rates. But before World War II, the birth rate of Jewish people in Bohemia and places like this is like 5, which is so the Jewish people already before World War II had like far lower birth rates than in their surrounding
which follows my first thesis. The longer you are in a low fertility environment, the longer you have to evolve protections against it.
Well, I would say that's part of it. I have a huge number of Jewish friends, and I actually I think that the part of the explanation is because Jewish fertility went from like super low to like Israeli fertility, jumped to like extremely high, like right away after World War II, because of the horrible tragedy, you had this jump to extreme explicit pronatalism, and I've had Jewish friends tell me, I just asked what to see what they'd say. Why do people in Israel have so many children? And they said, we tell however many you're going to have one more for those that were lost. And I was like, oh my God, but it just shows that, because I can show you another chart next, which is, let me stop sharing this one and share another one here. So we can see, this is just looking at Israel today.
But I would argue that that's a cultural innovation that could have evolved to adapt to the low fertility environments they found themselves in.
True story. Yeah, it could have. Well, and the response to tragedy is huge.
You are describing a cultural technique, which is to act as if you are always in a state of recent tragedy,
they actually were in a. So I'm just saying that there was this dramatic shift from the lowest, like far lower than the European average, to here we can see now.
Right, but I think what you're missing here, and I would argue that even 100 years from now, this strategy is still going to be implemented within Jewish communities because it's a successful strategy at motivating fertility rates, and therefore will outcompete the groups that don't do it. As Simone was mentioning the tsunami study, when a region's hit by a tsunami, like one thing that does seem to increase fertility rates is an immediate shock or a lot of death. This is likely what caused the baby boom. A bunch of people in this environment then coming back to their countries, of course, you'd have a lot of kids after that.
And just to clarify on what the tsunami study found, it looked at regions that were hit super hard by a tsunami and very close to each other. there were areas where a lot of people died and where a lot of people experienced the tsunami, but fewer people died. And they found that the birth rates were higher in those areas with like
Right.
literal higher
Right.
death
Yes.
counts, more
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who lost their children in genuine tragedy, which to me seemed quite counterintuitive. So this seems to track with that. I do think it's important to highlight, though, that I mean, if you just think through when a population crashes, in the end, the only people left are going to be those who somehow innovate a motivation to have more kids. Those are the only ones who are left. So it does make
Yeah.
sense, Malcolm's point too, that over time, you know, the longer that a group has had a lower fertility rate, the more likely that the only ones left are the ones who've already worked out how to continue having kids in the face of whatever it is that eliminated desire to have kids.
Well, yeah, I had an interesting experience. This was actually on New Year's Eve. I was a family here in Maryland was gracious enough to invite me into their home. Now, this was the home of a recently passed rabbi he was a renowned rabbi in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm not going to mention his name, but people who know will know who that is. But he left 150 descendants. So that's, so, and I got to meet and have great conversations with a couple of his grandchildren. So it was because this was kind of a memoriam celebration, of his life and so forth, and kind of a Jewish worship service.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be there. And one thing that just absolutely struck me was that, whatever walks of life his grandchildren, they all had this hardcore pronatal belief, just that having children is like super important. And his granddaughter had like several children, and she was also active in creating an organization to help young mothers who were just experiencing the transition from to motherhood for the first time, and to create a support network, so that she was pronatal to, not only for herself, but actually building like support pronatal networks.
Mhm.
So that's this.
No, and this is definitely something that is unique to Jewish communities, is the elevation of the high status members to being especially pronatalist. Where if you contrast this with, one of the groups that's been hit hardest by fertility rates, we always talk about as Catholic groups, have just been destroyed by falling fertility rates. They are some of the most susceptible groups outside of East Asians, and actually Orthodox Christians as well typically are destroyed by falling fertility rates. And we think with Catholics, one of the reasons is the high status, like the priest caste doesn't have kids or family at all. And when you look at the traditional Protestant families, which have done okay, but not as well, there's the tradition of like, the preacher's daughter and everything like that. But it's typically like prestigious preachers have 2 to 3 kids, but not large amounts of kids, which is really interesting that you point this out, that it is common for rabbis to have large amounts of kids.
Okay, so yeah, that is a great and remarkable thing, and I was just blown away, and I felt really lucky to kind of be a guest and a kind of a fly on the wall, or to kind of observe, because that was so interesting to me. So I want to talk about something completely different now, which is related to culture, but this is kind of something that I think very few people are aware of. So this, okay, here I'm gonna share the next thing. So I did an expose on Twitter. It got more than 100,000 views, so I'm glad it got some reach. But there's this organization called Population Connection.
Ooh, interesting.
Okay, so this is crazy. This is insane, but you wouldn't believe it except that it's true. And so Population Connection is the new name for an organization called Zero Population Growth. Now, have you heard of that?
Yes,
That is
continue.
Paul Ehrlich's organization.
Okay.
So the Paul Ehrlich, he's the one who started off, who like kicked off the
The OG antinatalist.
the OG anti-natalist, right? So he has this organization, formerly Zero Population Growth, now Population Connection.
Which sounds so much more diplomatic.
It does, and he has, they have these workshops where they train teachers, and he has trained on the order of like 100,000 teachers in America over the years through this organization, which is active today. And so it's on the surface, it's an environmental organization, but it's literally Paul Ehrlich's own organization, which is the president of that organization recently bragged that his education material through population connection, and it's his education arm, which is called population education. It educates in American and Canadian schools 3 million students a year.
Oh,
This
good
is
Lord.
this
Wow.
is
Yeah.
insane. What we see here is an example from their most popular video. So he has this thing that starts in the year 1. So you can see the header on top shows this is the world population in the year 1, like as in the time of the Romans and like when Jesus walked the earth and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
this is 170 million. So that's the baseline that he's using to show
Uh-huh.
overpopulation now, because this is like this is less than the current population of
So
like
that's what we need to go back to is a Roman times pre-industrial, of course.
Yes, that's what we want.
so
And
so
our
this
kids are
video
being
this video that he has, like it shows like a little exploding bomb. Okay,
Oh,
in
no.
every time, like there's more population added, and so it literally looks like the world of today is like on fire with people. And this is the education that's going out under the guise of environmentalism to like millions of
But I
students
think
every year.
we all know. I mean, if you don't realize that your kids are in brainwashing factories, you are foolish in the extreme. Like that is the school system today. Even when we were in the school system, I remember like the zero population brainwashing stuff. Like kids are bad, don't have kids, don't really start thinking about kids until after college. You know, it's incredibly hard. Yeah, so I do agree that it is difficult to fight against large scale and systemic brainwashing, especially when we have no cultural tools to backpedal in the ways that China and countries like that do. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, and so I really do think that there is some real low hanging fruit there. Like one thing that I think we have to sort of realize is that like normies like don't even know
I
kind of
don't think this is a low hanging fruit at all. I think this is a
well
high hanging fruit. So the
Hanging
reason
fruit.
it's a high hanging fruit is I could clear out an organization like this, but these beliefs are deeply held within the teaching class, the type of person who becomes an American middle school and high school teacher at a very high level. And even if we got rid of the people who planted these seeds, I think it'd be very hard to, because this is different. Like in China or in a lot of other cultures, when they're like, oh, our civilization could collapse, like a normal sane culture is like, oh, that's a bad thing, let's stop that. But there is this mimetic virus in America and in the West where when you say our civilization could collapse, they're like, oh, that's fantastic, we're evil, let's hasten that degrowth, you know.
yeah, you're right. It's yeah, there is a hardline element of people that are like cheering this on. I would also but I also think that when I say low hanging fruit, I mean at least among a lot of normies. Like you go to survey people on the street, and like I think a majority of people on the street, if you are like, is there overpopulation, are people having too many or too few children in America, like they will still think that we're facing overpopulation, and that's
Oh,
just
yeah.
like they just don't know, you know.
I
So
don't think there's any logic to their opinions. I think they're completely aesthetically driven.
yeah, I don't know. I think that a lot of people, and maybe I'm more optimistic than you in a certain sense,
Mhm.
but I think that there's a lot of people that just aren't even aware that population is not like totally like exploding. Like they think a lot of people
No,
still
this is
think that
true.
it's
Yeah.
it's like 1968 when the population bomb was published. They think it's like 1968 still. They
This is
just
true
don't know
about
the new
so many
data.
facts that are threatening to the urban monoculture. You know, I point out things like IQ is dropping, and they're like, no, the Flynn effect. And I'm like, bro, the Flynn effect hasn't been active since like the 1970s. Like, what are you on? You know, but yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Well, this has been fantastic. I love, let's put a target on these organizations. Let's find a way to take them down so that they stop at least proliferating this message.
Well, I
And
think, yeah, raising awareness about this does make a difference because parents feeling outraged about their children being
yeah,
effectively mimetically sterilized at school will cause some backlash because a lot of parents
but
want grandchildren, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
it's been great to have you on.
Yeah.
We would absolutely love to have you back, and thanks for your time.
Yeah.
And
Thanks
do
so
check
much.
him
And
out on
remember,
Twitter.
oh,
check
it's
out
been
More Births
wonderful.
on Twitter. Yes.
Yeah, you're gonna find a lot of good charts, good data, and if you're the kind of person who loves visuals, you will love More Birth's Twitter slash
Um,
X.
Yeah,
Oh, and
good
another
threads.
thing you can check out if you're interested, because I was just shocked to look at this. This is like day 3 after we started. What is that thing called? Our Discord server, right?
Oh.
Like, it has 56 active members right now and 165 people, and we only first mentioned it yesterday.
So also check out our
So
Discord, but how do people find it?
I'll put like a link on the screen and then in the
Sweet.
comments that they can check out. Anyway,
Good.
been great to have you.
Yeah, Daniel, you rock.